Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Sonic Ringbond writing stream. I'm your host, AU creator and main author, Joshua Tarwater. You can find me at Twitter. Well, you can find me on Twitter at Josh Tarwater, and we'll be getting started here in just a moment. Been having some difficulty with Spotify in the background recently. Everyone who is listening along there at the beginning would have been listening to the Sonic Ringbond main theme as composed by Shimshon the Gadite over on Twitter. Highly recommend giving him a listen. And let's see here, as I like to do at the start of every stream, and welcome first-time viewers, whether here on the stream or on YouTube. Sonic Ringbond is a Sonic the Hedgehog AU story, which I created after I came up with a redesign for Amy Rose based on the idea of having Sonic's moveset rather than the Pico Pico Hammer. And the AU itself, as I grew and developed the ideas, became one in which the rings are a major part of the world and not just a gameplay mechanic from the games. And so that's what informs just about everything there. For today's story, going to be joining Sonic as he tears up the inside of a crash death egg bobbing in the ocean. Unfortunately, I'm just a little lacking in inspiration this time around. And that's not anyone in particular's fault. That is entirely on me. It's just been a bit of a rough week. So to those who want to listen along to what I am listening to while I write, since I won't play it on stream, forget the Japanese reading. Really just need to take the time to learn the language. But I am listening to pretty much a song that translates as Terrible from the Falcon Sound Team JDK off of the Gulaming original soundtrack. So let's go ahead and get right into it. And I'll make it up as I go along, as I always do. If you have any questions or want to share your own thoughts on my works, feel free to comment in the chat. Always glad to respond. Now, let me pause here. And the reason for such, for those who are joining me for the first time, is because I'm structuring my story around the idea of designing a video game. And I won't go into details on it, but so you'll see me throughout my writings update information so as to address the idea of the video game based information and to help me stay focused on where I'm writing things. So there's a bit to cover here. Just gotta double check all my notes. So mind me as I take the time to fill them out. I love the grammar systems of Microsoft Word, constantly in conflict with each other. And there we go. With that, I wrap up today's scene. Didn't necessarily go exactly the way I could say I planned it, but I can't really say that it was planned either. But again, I kind of do a right from the seat of my pants style, or a make it up as I go approach, and as such, that results in literally not always having a plan. Usually, though, I have a bit more outline in mind than I did coming into this weekend stream. But things didn't quite work for me this week, and my mind's been all over the place. But I will go ahead and leave everyone on break and talk about what I made up today and what my intentions were. For the most part, though, I'm going to say now that the idea of the game design probably saved me with today's scene. So, I'll be back in a bit, everyone. Enjoy the Sonic Ringbond main theme. And 15 to 30 minutes is my usual break time, so I'll see everyone in a bit. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you after the break. And welcome back, everyone, to the Sonic Ring Bond writing stream. Good morning to you, Mecha from the 80s. Hope I didn't miss you as you came in during a break. Let's see here. As we're back from break, a quick introduction. I'm glad to see that you're still here. Mind me as I go through my quick introductions for anybody new to my streams or watching this on YouTube and skip the first half. I'm your host, Joshua Tarwater, the creator and author for Sonic Ring Bond, a Sonic the Hedgehog AU, created after I redesigned Amy Rose, based on the idea of what if she had ended up with Sonic's moveset rather than the Pico Pico Hammer. And the AU itself is rooted deeply in the idea of the rings being a more regular part of the world. All of that said, today's stream, episode of New History 7, well, today's scene was quite a bit of a challenge, actually. Normally when I come into these scenes, I have some sort of idea or plan or something written down somewhere for what I want to do with the scene. Today, that was anything but the case. And what ends up happening is I gotta go with the basics of what I'm working with. And a lot of people would say at this point, fall back on techniques. And if you're someone who's familiar with me, I'm horrible at creative techniques. My brain and creative techniques don't really agree. However, I do understand story logic, and a lot of what's going on with storytelling is you'll start with things relatively low, slowly build up to your climax, and then drop off into your write-out. So, with episode of New History, it is introduced with an initial scene showing the remnant, showing that the remnant is Amy Rose. That's a memory of the rings as Sonic being supersonic is there. And then as we move forward from that, he's coming to with this lingering in his head a week after the defeat of Eggman on the Death Egg. And I'm constantly building to Sonic going to confront Eggman to see if he's the one responsible for what he's going through. It's just a slow, gradual build-up. While on the side, I've been slowly building a mystery around the rings, which shouldn't be surprising since the very opening of the story is set with Benedict Yodoku, the God of Rings, and the main non-Eggman villain of my AU. And so, as I pretty much made this scene up as I was writing it, significantly more so than usual, I had to keep in mind that I am supposed to be transitioning from seeing the state of the Death Egg and introducing the mystery to why it's like this, and still focusing on something going on with the rings and Sonic going to confront Eggman. And so pretty much what this scene ends up being is an introduction to Eggman early on, to eventually setting up the transitions to show Sonic moving forward to face Eggman. And another thing that I start to do with this scene is I do start to transition away from showing Sonic's thoughts. And that may be a bit of a peculiar thing to do since I've been alright showing his thoughts up to this point. But at this point, I'm feeling it's better to infer that he's being bothered by things so much as delve heavily into it. So while the preview screen for today's summary implies that Sonic's bothered by nothing being different, it doesn't really end up reflected in the scene. So, to that end, let's go ahead and dive in and see what I was able to accomplish. I will start with some editing because my writing's not making any sense to me. To those who aren't familiar with how my stream setups are, typically the first half I'll write the scene, the second half I'll sit down and talk about what I was thinking. And so you'll see me highlight a paragraph like this, and I'll just usually read through it real quick before I start talking about it. And so as I finish reading that up, the idea to my little openings before I set into the idea of what zone I'm in and the act numbers is first would use this opening paragraph to talk and set the scene. And in this case, one of the reasons why it's important to move away from Sonic's point of view, and here I start to establish Eggman's point of view, while still leaving enough hints here and there to imply that Eggman could still be experiencing what Sonic is, or that he could be behind it, but I'm starting to ease off of that idea. And so the idea that I'm putting up with is to establish that things are not as Eggman would like them to be. And this is supposed to start to create the disconnect for the reader of Sonic blaming Eggman, even though Eggman is not to blame. And what I end up doing is why in prior scenes I've done my best to build Eggman up, to show him as credible, to show him as a threat. In this scene, I take the time instead to tear him down and remove the idea of him being a threat, but not to undermine Eggman as a character, but to allow the shift in focus to move away from Eggman, to go, yes, he's Eggman, he is the greatest threat the world knows, but conversely, he's not the problem right now. And so it's an interesting balance to work with, to keep Eggman as dangerous as he should be, but to also strip away his importance at this point of the story so I can shift away from him. And so it's kind of weird that I have to introduce him and take the focus off of him, but it's necessary for the story I'm telling, because as we approach the end of this, there's probably 2, maybe 3 more scenes I would say left in Episode of New History before we'll finally be moving past what I'm going to call pretty much the prologue of the story, and we'll finally be getting to Amy and my OC and letting them settle in as additional leads of the AU. I mean, ultimately, Rosie herself is the main character of my AU, since the idea is to explore Amy and the Son-Amy dynamic, but storytelling and the nature and structure of Sonic's world requires a little bit more storytelling focus than I would normally give this. And as I've tried to write stories before in the past, there are things that have reflected to me very much the nature and structure of how Sonic's, as an IP and a sandbox to tell stories, is set up in. And so, to tell a story that feels believably like a Sonic story, you have to embrace these ideas and limitations, even as they feel like they could interfere and create difficulties in telling the story that I want to tell. Still, it's an interesting way to go about it, and it does allow me to learn quite a bit about the characters, what they do, and what they focus on. And so, again, the idea is I get to introduce Eggman finally, but I also have to introduce the idea that despite the threat he poses, he's not currently the problem. And so, as I go into my typical approach to introducing a scene and setting it with my quick sentences so the audience can see it, I start to, again, build the idea of Eggman not being the problem. And so I focus with this description, not only in throwing out the quick lines so people can imagine the scene in their head, it is again showing where Eggman's mind is. Tiny planet built technology, obviously talking about the Death Egg, and inverted life taking all of its own. And so this is implying there's an invasion happening. Probably a bad choice of words in light of world events, but we'll go ahead and work with it for now. Machines of technology, creatures of stone. Again, I'm creating the contrast, showing there's a conflict here. And then, I make it kind of blatant, a conflict raging. And so I imply that it's violent, it's active. And then as I switch from this, it's able to also create the emotional lead into Dr. Eggman. Watch from within a tiny space. And so it's not only describing where I currently have Eggman, which I will cover in later detail in tomorrow's scene, not this one, is a tiny space is to imply that Eggman's lost a lot of ground. It's not just talking about where he is, but he's lost a lot of ground. He is losing this fight against the greenery. However, as we follow up, go too small, yet perfectly fit. Again, this is both a reference to Eggman's genius and how he creates the things around himself, and saying that the space should be too small, yet he fits in it perfectly. That's a highlight to his genius and how well he makes his stuff, but it's also a reference to the fact that despite the fact that he's been backed into a corner, he's been able to cater this corner to be what he wants it to be. Hence again why I say a work of genius. He's losing, but he's not losing outside of his own terms. And then everything goes sideways with a sudden distraction. And that's where Sonic enters into the scene and starts to make a mess of things. And we'll ignore some of Microsoft's Word's stranger tendencies. And so that's where we start with Eggman. Is we saw him boastful in the videos in the prior scene, whereas in this scene, things are outside of his control and he's throwing a temper tantrum about it. Now, as I work through his temper tantrum, and again, I use dialogue to imply he's in a very cramped space. He doesn't have a lot of room to work with. And I then used the word casualties, implying that he's got no room and he's still losing more. And path of destruction is implying things are falling apart around him. However, I still want to highlight that Eggman is a genius. And so as we move into the next paragraph, let me just go ahead and highlight that for everyone, since I didn't highlight the last one, is Eggman recognizes a pattern in the chaos. And there had not been a pattern up to this point, and that's part of what has made things difficult for him. And we'll go ahead and ignore word freaking out over hyphens. And so with this scene, as he recognizes that pattern, he's able to also piece together the objectives of the pattern he's seeing. His space station is suddenly being systematically attacked, something which has not been happening with this vegetative overgrowth, which has just been, it's growing everywhere and anywhere it can set root down. And suddenly you have the structured path of destruction within, and he's able to see a clear attack against them. And of course, there's only one person that he knows of who can attack him at such a speed. And so now as I give control back to Eggman, you'll see me with this next paragraph describe his actions as masterful. He's a showman, a clown, a joke to interact with, but he is a genius. He is, in my eyes, and how I try to and want to present him, even as I move him out of importance at this point in the story, he is meant to be perceived as genius. And now, as I said, I've started to shift away from Sonic's focus, and with this scene, it's particularly easy to do since I start the scene with Eggman's focus. And as such, though Sonic is bothered, if one's been following along, they would know that at this point why Sonic is bothered is because of what he remembers and what he's seeing. And so, if you're not familiar with Sonic and Knuckles, you as the audience won't necessarily know what's bothering Sonic in this scene. Is it something familiar or is it something unfamiliar? You would just know that the situation is bothering Sonic. And for those who would like to know, it's actually because the scene is familiar. The Death Egg Core robot is actually a boss fight in Act 1 of Death Egg Zone in Sonic and Knuckles. It's a bit of a pain in the neck fight, too. And so Sonic has now defeated it exactly where it's supposed to be. Sure, there's flooding and vegetative overgrowth and all these problems, but an enemy that he knows and exactly where it's supposed to be is indeed there, despite the differences that are all around him anyway. And so Sonic is having this internal conflict of his own, which I recap at the end of the scene, where what he knows and what's different are sitting side by side and creating something he can't wrap his own mind around yet. And it's really bothering him. And a lot of people would say, well, that's kind of out of character for Sonic to be bothered by something he doesn't understand. Normally it would excite him, and he would pursue the mystery and the adventure that comes with it. And I fully agree that normally that would be the case with Sonic. However, to imply that he never worries when he's faced with unknown situations is also a bit of a lie. one has to remember again that despite his confidence, he does think about these things, and you'll see it reflected a lot throughout the series. And usually he will rely on his wit to push himself forward and keep himself motivated. But also, again, I'm a big fan of the OVA, as I've said. And in there, you'll see Sonic doubt. You'll see Sonic choose to run. You'll see Sonic recognize situations as not good. He won't just joke his way through it. He will face the fact that things aren't quite right. There's a seriousness about him after he loses to Metal Sonic. Just meeting Metal Sonic in the OVA for the first time literally sends a chill down his spine. There is a visible discomfort on Sonic facing Metal Sonic for the first time. And so the unknown, when it is beyond what he can properly comprehend, or it's completely unexpected, it can bother him as much as it excites him. And that again brings us to that conflict. And so in this case, Sonic is literally taking a moment to think about the scenario and what exactly it is that's bothering him. And mind me as I correct something else, thinking of using it more as a break, but it works better as just more so a regular, just small break in the narrative, so to say. And we'll get to that, because that's going to be another point where my idea of structuring my story around the idea of making a game will be affecting the story. But also, there's also the idea of what is important to the story and what is important to a game. And it creates a bit of a gap there, but we'll get to that. And so, of course, we start off with Dr. Eggman and his iconic laugh. If you're not familiar with the da ha 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 version of Eggman's laugh, I would recommend the Sonic Drift instruction manual from Japan, and you will find in there that exact laugh from Eggman. And that is the laugh that I'm using for Eggman, the Sonic Drift instruction manual being a huge inspiration for what eventually even led to me deciding to try my hand at redesigning Amy, because seeing her address Sonic as Sonic Sama in there inspired me to completely restudy her character and how she was used. And she's always been one of my favorites, literally from day one in Sonic CD. Being able to restudy her and discover that there was so much more to her than I ever recognized, it was an exhilarating experience. And so Sonic Drift, despite the fact it's not really a praised game, it's not even considered a good kart racer, not even for a handheld, but that instruction manual kind of means a lot to me, and it's got one of the best commercials in my opinion, of showing both that Amy should not have karmic immunity as Sonic X gave her, but that she's also a playful rascal, which you will rarely see in the series or the IP in general, outside of when you have someone like Tyson Hess writing her. And as a result, I don't have a hard time really seeing why a lot of people don't like Amy's character, because it's very rarely used well. Now, that's not to say that it hasn't been, and that I haven't enjoyed plenty of moments, but she has so many inconsistencies that it's very easy to miss her actual character, because it's usually kind of cruising along underneath the surface level presentations of her, and she's usually steered from the surface instead of by her foundation, and that has a tendency of making her be whatever the writer wants her to be in any given story, which isn't good storytelling. You still, no matter what you want a character doing in a story, have to write the character from their foundation and figure out what can you do with the story that will make them fit. And that's why we may have certain corrections that I'll address in this scene, but we'll get to that, because I have to make sure I keep Eggman's ego intact. And so, a little exchange between Sonic and Eggman now that they have the room to interact. And at this point, it becomes more of a visual storytelling problem versus a video game storytelling problem versus a writing storytelling problem. And these problems may not necessarily present themselves clearly to people early on, but like if I was writing a book, what would happen in this scene is I would detail Sonic's continuing adventure through the Death Egg. I would talk about looking at how the forests have overgrown the Death Egg. I would talk about Sonic's expressions as he runs through these forests, takes elevators, goes around on the glowing ring loop-de-loops, which are so annoying to deal with, and Death Egg Zone. The conveyor belts and electrified floors, the missiles and traps, just all over the place. It's a very deadly, very dangerous zone. And these are things that would normally be important. The problem is this would work better in long form storytelling. Whereas as I write to put my work on Tapas and to post regular updates, my story structure has to fit within a very small space. And so I have to ask, useful as those descriptions are, wouldn't they just fit better in one of these links for me? And as such, they do, and it will be a great place to use those in the next scene. But let's see if I actually remember I say that tomorrow. I'm going to doubt it, but I'll try to store it in the back of my mind to remember, describe the obstacles of the Death Egg, and not just the trappings of the locations. But in a visual medium, what ends up just being document notes over here for me, talking about the whole idea of the fight and everything, I actually kind of mess up. Because I don't start the next cutscene. I gladly end it, though. I need to make sure I take the time to update that. So let's go ahead and squeeze that in real quick. And yes, I'm actually... Oh, we'll see in a bit, Mecha from the 80s. My notes are going to look all over the place because of my split writing, but we're not going to worry about that. So, as I said, I have this exchange between Sonic and Eggman. And Sonic's jokes are typically designed to be reflective of the situation and to use the situation in a disrespectful and insulting way to break up the psyche of the person that he's talking to, typically Eggman. And so, as I move forward to Eggman's response, his big laughter and everything, I still present the idea that he's always building, always making something new, putting his genius to work, and taking pride in it. But he's also admitting to being distracted, and that things aren't going quite the way he wants them to be going. And so, this is when we get to the problem then of game needs versus long form storytelling versus short form storytelling versus visual storytelling versus written storytelling. Is what we end up here is I totally cut out Sonic's fight with Megasonic Mark II. And literally, there's any number of ways this could go throughout the thing. As Sonic proceeds forward, he has his encounter with Megasonic. He fights him. It's a nice little fight and distraction in a video game. And it's why I have this note down here detailing that the scene ends. It's now another action stage. And then there's the boss fight against Megasonic. Then once the boss fight's over, the next cutscene starts here with cutscene 9. And you'll even see I have this time skip. I had considered using these 3 dots as a center of the page 3 dot to show a break in time, but I've instead opted to use it as just a paragraph 3 dots to kind of do that TV style cut where Eggman's laughing because he's just bragged about his latest invention, and then suddenly the scene cuts and you see his latest invention as a heap of scrap on the ground. And so this is also now where a joke is coming in. That can work better in visual form, and in fact even having Tails and Sonic talk before Eggman could break the flow of the joke. But in this case, I'm also trying to imply that the joke isn't necessarily as important, so much as progressing the events. And also, for as much as seeing Sonic fight this machine and this and that, and I could have again dwelled heavily on the ideas of Sonic and his memory problems, even the summary for the scene says the first half is about Eggman, and Eggman and the problem that is Sonic. And so, presenting the viewpoint of what Sonic did, showing the confidence, and then showing Eggman's response builds up to go, yes, Sonic is a problem for Eggman. And so what we have happening at this scene is that, again, I'm switching away from focusing too heavily on Sonic's memory problems and just timeline problems in general, so as to highlight what is actually going on and what the difficulties are. And so we'll go into this in Tails' response. Then we have just a second to read it, make sure I don't miss anything myself. Such as unnecessary capitalization. And again, a bit more joking from Sonic. And this joking, it's a bit trickier to do at this point because it is distracting from the fact that this is another point of Sonic encountering something familiar. But at this point of the scene, it's not about Sonic and his responses. It's about Eggman and his responses. And I'm showing Sonic as a problem for Eggman. I'm building up to the idea that as Sonic progresses, he becomes a bigger and bigger threat for Eggman. And that's going to bring us to the climax of the episode of what should be a fight between Sonic and Eggman. Now, how much I'll detail the fight, I wouldn't say I'm good at writing fights, but I would rather focus on the narrative. It's one of the advantages, I would say, of visual storytelling, is you can really highlight the fight and exploit the visual medium for people. Maybe one day an artist will come along who likes my story so much, they will do a comic adaptation of it for free. For now, though, I have no such hopes or illusions, and will simply do my best to tell my story and let the imagination of the reader fill in gaps such as that type of fight. But now that I've let Sonic and Tails get out of the way, we get back to Eggman and his response. We show the disappointment, and now, by taking advantage of Sonic and Tails talking first, I am able to make the shift from Eggman throwing a temper tantrum to him more naturally. But even then, I can actually see ways to restructure this, and I'm debating if I should. I think I'm actually going to, because it actually does work with the joke and the break. So, and welcome back, Mecha from the 80s. You just missed me talking about the structure of my story and the whole idea of a joke setup. And pretty much just talk myself into making a change I didn't think I was going to need to make. And okay, like this, I'm going to say the overall joke flows better now. From Eggman bragging about his genius, laughing, the pause, Eggman fuming as his mustache droop, and then Tails' remarks and Sonic making a joke out of the situation. And again, it won't be particularly visible here, especially as Eggman's angry. And as you'll notice, as Eggman's angry, I exclude details except for those things which further enrage Eggman. And this is the show where Eggman's focus is while he's angry is on things that make him angry. And so it's a good way to hide Sonic's discomfort and again keep the focus on Eggman at this point of the scene. But of course, Eggman does have his own sense of humor, and it allows him to have his own laugh at Sonic's expense as the scene progresses. And then you'll see Sonic's exasperation in response to Eggman still shifting things back in his own favor, even if he just lost one of his best creations. And it's a fan favorite. A little more than a quick cameo in my story, though. Very sorry, Mechasonic Mark II fans. Know you love him, but really he's just Silver Sonic with a different coat of paint. And a super form, but we're not going to worry about that. And now I gotta, as I said, Eggman shifts a loss into a small victory by shifting a loss into a victory by tormenting Sonic with the ideas of what he was going to be using Mecha Sonic Mark II for. And so this exasperation I now bring up to Sonic is meant to show again that Eggman is taking the lead. And so even though Tails left and Sonic's talking to him, I now get to again start to show the danger that Eggman presents. And so as Sonic and Tails are distracted by this tendency to crack wise and be witty in situations they should be more cautious in, it now allows Eggman to weigh on the situation and go, wait a second, where's Tails? And again, it also gets the shift to showing Eggman and his childishness, but also his pride and his distaste of what others do. And so now as Eggman's pretty much throwing a tantrum again at the mess Tails made, get a chance to set up Sonic's current goals, which is going, of course, to go see Eggman. But of course, he's still going to make light of it. He's trying to keep his focus out the fact that Tails is in danger, and it's what allows Tails to laugh and look at the situation positively, is that Sonic is taking the worry out of it. And of course, he's also still continuing to throw insults Eggman's way to keep Eggman's attention on him. He's literally being cheeky and witty here to both motivate Tails and to keep his head level while keeping Eggman's attention on him. It's a lot he's doing with the jokes here, and so while I try not to write Sonic too much into the Spider-Man direction, preferring to keep Sonic more serious if possible, and more focused, I do understand how wit and jokes work in a story and in a narrative and how they bounce off of other characters rather than turning to the audience and telling the audience jokes. He's literally multitasking here with his words and relying on his wit to control the situation. And that's something I forgot I really should be doing with Tails' laugh. It's one of the fun things, of course, again, about writing the way that I write, is that I change how I'm doing things all the time on a regular basis. I'm certain it's frustrating to read, but I hope the storytelling itself and the story itself is at least engaging and entertaining enough to kind of forgive the problem. And now, as we move past these exchanges and the purposes to them, we get to this little exchange between Eggman and Tails. And the idea here, and the follow-up as well, is that one of my big things as a fan of the Sonic IP is I do not like the fact that Tails went from being a fox boy who was a genius in his own right, but was limited to tinkering, to being I'm as smart and great a genius to Eggman to where if I wanted to make my own evil empire of robots, I could. And so I use this opportunity to knock Tails down a few pegs, to show that Eggman is well above him when it comes to being a genius. But also I take the time to still show Tails' own genius and show it through tinkering rather than he's just smarter than everybody because he's Tails. That honestly makes Tails a very obnoxious and unlikable character to me. And it's a problem I've had with this character back and forth over the years. When he's a genius in tinkering and can use that in certain situations, and he's still this lacking in confident kid who looks up to Sonic and pursues Sonic not just for the friendship that he develops with him, but because it brings him confidence, this dream of becoming a hero like Sonic himself one day. Even though the reality is that Sonic himself, despite the fact that his actions are heroic and that he is perceivable as a hero, he is typically motivated by adventure and satiating his own desires before he's motivated by his own kindness and his sense of justice. However, when his kindness and sense of justice are triggered, they are usually greater forces than his selfishness, and his selfishness usually aligns with these aspects of his character. And so, it's an interesting aspect of Sonic's character, but it's also important to me to make sure that Tails does not surpass Sonic, because when he surpasses Sonic, it also means he has to surpass Eggman, and if you consider Tails' character structure, and part of his character structure is the kid genius trope, you suddenly have Tails as the smartest, most competent character around, and it leaves him as a braggart. It wipes away his lack of confidence and his constant need to try to grow and learn as a kid. And he just becomes obnoxious and unbearable because he's the one who's always right, and if you disagree with him, he's going to be a brat with no karma, which is one of the things that makes Amy unlikable to a lot of people, is when she's presented as a brat with no karma. And brats without karma are not enjoyable characters. So, little surprised that I have situations where I can frequently find that I dislike Tails. And it usually comes to mishandling of his traits and mishandling of his relationship and his place in regards to Sonic and Eggman. And so this exchange between the two is to highlight that he's a genius in his own way, but he's got nothing on Eggman, even if he's smart enough to mess with Eggman's stuff and find backdoors in that he can make himself. And it's a difficult balance with Tails' intellect, because it's way too easy to overplay it and make Eggman look dumb in response. Now, of course, as I said, though, before all of that little bit of a tangent, Sonic at this point in my narrative is trying to get Eggman's attention on him. And now that attention is on Sonic, this is the big transition point now, and Sonic is going, I'm trying to figure out what your latest scheme is. And he's now gone out of his way to really emphasize it's about him and what he's trying to understand. And now that I've made that shift, I can now start to focus again on Sonic and his sense of familiarity, the memories versus the events that are happening, this clash of timelines, this major difference which doesn't make sense. And so I'm able to introduce confusion into Eggman, which is something I talk about at the beginning of the scene. Despite being the smartest man on the planet, when he's confused, it's insulting as much as it is a challenge. And so now, though, this is also frustrating Sonic because Sonic has painted this picture in his head already that this is Eggman's fault. And part of the reason it's possible to have Sonic do that is if you look at the series as a whole, all we as the audience ever gets to see of Sonic's adventures, aside from Sonic and the Black Knight and Sonic and the Secret Rings, the storybook games, it always boils down to Sonic versus Eggman. Every adventure, Eggman shows up. Sonic and the Black Knight is literally the only game in the entire franchise where Eggman makes no appearance and has no mention. He just simply does not matter in that game. It's the only time in the entire franchise. Even Secret Rings, where it's Erazar Jin as the main antagonist, Eggman still has a physical appearance via the Sultan. And so, of course, Sonic sees him, and he immediately thinks Eggman and Eggman's scheme. Suddenly, it's all Eggman's fault. Erazar Jin is totally out of Sonic's mind for this scene because he's blaming Eggman immediately. And this tells us, and it's one of the reasons I don't mind actually going with the direction presenting Sonic's memories of everything else and his adventures is going, well, it was all just a dream. Because by saying it was all just a dream, tacky and cliched as that approach is, one of the things about a dream is it allows the idea of Sonic hyper focusing on Eggman. I mean, literally, if you think about where my story starts, it's at the end of Sonic 2. Sonic is hurtling from the Death Egg. Literally, he just fought Eggman in a life or death battle. His own life is on the line as he's literally falling to Earth in his last encounter with Eggman. Everything is as wrong as it can possibly be, and it's all Eggman's fault. Being able to relax, stopped by Eggman. This whole adventure, because of Eggman. His life on the line, because of Eggman. Him having the Chaos Emeralds, because of Eggman. Literally everything that follows, it's always Eggman, 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 Eggman. This is a hyperfixation which results in a lot of people complaining about the biggest thing about Sonic stories not being told as an episodic road trip, and that is that Sonic's rogues gallery is too small. But the moment you say it was all a dream, even if that's not necessarily true, but by being able to say that, it's possible to take all this and go, oh, it was just a dream. Sonic was so stressed out by Eggman that he dreamt of all these further adventures of him fighting Eggman because Eggman has just totally dominated his mind all the way to the point of even his current adventures. His life on the line is Eggman, 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 Eggman. He can't stop thinking about him. His brain is totally stressed out by Eggman. It's trying to figure out countless scenarios to resolve the Eggman problem. Now, ultimately, I will say, and it's not really a spoiler, no, none of it was a dream. The games happened all before the events of this story. It's just because of the nature of how things go and plot elements which I will detail in the future that things have ended up the way they are and that all of it can now be written off as a dream by anybody in story except for Sonic due to having lived it himself. But back on the story itself, again, this accusation and this anger from Sonic. And Sonic's anger is a trait a lot of people don't talk about too often. And so Sonic's expectations are breaking, and he's entering a state of denial. And I'm going to play with that denial for just a little bit because it is necessary to help keep Sonic focused on Eggman through the climax, and then I'll be able to let it go after the climax as I set up what the next major event will be for Sonic, even though we won't be hanging around with Sonic after the end of this episode. But it is a necessity for the most part right now to use this denial to keep him hounding Eggman. And it's also with me kind of showing that he's developed this obsession. I'm not fond of Sonic being the superhero type. I've said that before, and I'll gladly say it again. Doesn't matter that Sonic CD he was advertised as such. A lot of things that I've seen do not present Sonic as a superhero, despite how it's easy to perceive him as such. And so I'm kind of playing with that obsession of fighting Eggman that has been established in too much of the media recently, to the point that you'll get the jokes online with Sonic going, "It's pretty much my job," with that really annoying chortle that Roger Craig Smith will say it with. Oh, it makes me shudder thinking about it. That is not the Sonic I know and love, and I want to get him back to being that character, just as much as I want to explore Amy free of the Pico Pico hammer and the weapons of mass destruction, hair trigger temper that she was given in X and shaped a lot of her character over the years, into the point that her entire character was thrown out and she was just literally her skin walking around without anything in there anymore. These are all things I do think about. And, it's like, how can I make Eggman a threat, but also the jovial, clownish showman that he is? How can I address my concerns with Tails as a character? And so as the AU progresses, even as I introduce tons of OCs, because any road trip story, which will be the structure I will follow, will need OCs. Even as I introduce more villains, even as I introduce more conflicts, I still have questions about the game cast and how can I use them? How can I address what they became versus what they were, what their purposes were versus what their new purposes were? Can I reconcile it, or would it be better just to make them function this way in my story? And it's different things to approach. So yes, the AU is going to have a lot of characters. It will even have versions of characters like, say, from the Freedom Fighters. I don't know how much I will use them, because they are a very tricky group of characters to use in a game-centric setting, because their stories and narratives just don't fit. They are literally at their best a one-game destination, one-off characters, and then Sonic moves on. And it's how they should have always been written, even all the way back into Saturday morning cartoon, except they gave Sonic a backstory, which didn't even match the Sonic Bible from Sega of America backstory. And that backstory, which the Saturday morning cartoon gave Sonic, is actually what created the majority of the problems with the Freedom Fighters and those characters, is literally the idea that DIC gave Sonic their own backstory, and Sega of America just accepted it, even in spite of their backstory for Sonic. And it's what makes the Fleetway stuff bizarre, as the Fleetway stuff mixes and matches together the DIC ideas and the Sega ideas, and so you get the Freedom Fighters as led by Sonic, but he's still a globe-trotting adventurer who doesn't hang around with loyalty to a kingdom and have this background with the people of it. And it's kind of interesting how that type of stuff happens. And so exploring the characters will be interesting. The thing is, though, is in light of how the various characters interact with the world and their roles and their actions, I would say that before a certain event later on, which I'll consider the end of the first major story arc, is that I can not really use Sally Acorn. And a lot of people would go, no, you say you're going to use the Freedom Fighters, you have to use Sally. And no, I said there were going to be my own takes on the characters in my AU. But one of the things about Sally that's always made her an interesting character is her reliance on Nicole and the way that she works together with Nicole. The two of them are a team, and to work with either of them on their own, it doesn't feel right breaking up that team. But because of the nature of my AU, and it'll be more understandable a couple of episodes from now when the actual technology of the setting starts to become shown, it'll become more obvious why I can't use Sally this early in the story, and why her relationship with Nicole dictates for me that she's not used until significantly later in the story. So that way, I can establish reason for Nicole to be in the world. That to me is kind of a necessity. But that's all a long time from now, and kind of a bit of a long tangent. But as it started talking about backstory, that's again what these chapters are for, is I'm setting the background for the AU with this. The Sonic and Eggman clashes from the games are here. If you're familiar with them, here they are. But the world is different, and Sonic doesn't know why, and he can't blame Eggman, even though he wants to blame Eggman, and so he's currently in a state of denial and over-focusing on Eggman. And one of my concerns about Sonic, and the way he was presented, especially during the 2010s, is it's very easy to read him as a bully instead of a hero. And because it's possible to read him as a bully instead of a hero, I end up with this scenario where I have to play to that idea. And so with this paragraph here, I literally have Eggman even calling Sonic a nuisance. There is literally no reason for them to be fighting at this time. Eggman has other problems which his attention is on, and he doesn't even care about Sonic at the moment. But Sonic and his established Eggman obsession from most other media is driving that denial of Sonic. Now, I don't want to dwell on it too much, so I take the time with the next paragraph to have Eggman break away to delve into Eggman's ego, but also to break him away from the scenario that's going on. To show Eggman getting full of himself with Sonic's obsession. Because realistically, if Sonic was that obsessed with Eggman, Eggman would delight in it. That Sonic is just absolutely terrified of him. He has to make everything because of Eggman. Every problem's because of Eggman. He's just putting Eggman on this pedestal of absurdity, and Eggman and his vainglorious ego are going to eat that up. And so much so, though I have him eating it up, that I take the time for him to be disappointed that he just can't go squash Sonic himself and revel in this perception of fear he has. And thus he cuts out laughing away because he feels like he's won, he's in control. And so, as I move to the next Sonic paragraph, as I make some corrections, I now show Sonic bothered. Eggman's blowing him off. Eggman is not considering him important. Eggman is not taking the blame for what's happening. And this has Sonic bothered. Things are not like he knows. And Sonic's so bothered by it that I show Tails pick it up. And Tails is now nervous. He's feeling like he's got to help his hero. But does he really have what it takes? And so he has to try to get Sonic not to focus on Eggman as the source of his problems. And even though this irritates Sonic, and I make sure I continue to press that irritation in his character, he still also has the denial, but also is thinking of the larger picture. And he asks about the Chaos Emeralds. And I'm now even using Tails in a way I don't normally like Tails to be used, which is the voice of reason. As usually when Tails is being used as the voice of reason, it's at the expense of Sonic's intelligence. In this case, I'm trying to use him as the force of reason against Sonic's obsessiveness. And I don't even like having to highlight this obsessiveness in Sonic, because it really shows me how lost over the years Sonic as a character became, and as a huge fan of Sonic and his character, that upsets me a lot. And so I'm able to take these two things I don't typically like, this obsessiveness of Sonic's and Tails as the voice of reason, and I'm able to play them in a way to where they can actually work storytelling wise and continue to set the story without compromising the characters and who they were, who they are, and how I, as the creator of the AU, feels they work best. Now, as Tails also plays the voice of reason, I also use that time to switch up now and put focus back on the rings, which of course have been a constant. I mentioned them before that it would appear the rings were siphoning off the chaos energy from Sonic. I've mentioned before how the rings shape the world. I'm constantly talking about the rings, and now Tails is mentioning an odd ring signature, and he wants to go investigate it. I'm now planting a seed or a hook for another event to come. And so again, I'm showing a shift of focus off of Eggman, even from other characters. But of course, Sonic still has this obsession. It hasn't been resolved yet. And this resolution of his obsession is pretty much going to be the climax of this episode. And the point to the climax is going to be to finally break Sonic's Eggman obsession and there's multiple reasons for that. As a storyteller, ultimately breaking this obsession for me will serve to free Sonic of Eggman. He will finally be able to go, it's not about Eggman. I don't have to always think about Eggman. I can just not. And even though there's obviously going to be other problems for Sonic to investigate, other adventures to have, by breaking this Eggman obsession, despite Eggman staying the main villain, and I will use him as such, by breaking the Eggman obsession, I will open up the entire world. It is no longer a world that is as tiny as just Sonic versus Eggman. It is now anything could be out there, and it could be anywhere. And by opening the world like this, it will allow me to tell countless stories in countless different ways, using countless characters, creating countless characters, and just letting the world constantly evolve and grow, and never be so tiny as to have to be contained to Sonic and his friends as a superhero group fight Eggman. That strips away the size of the world, strips away the size and scope of the stories, and strips away even Sonic's need to be fast. And as such, breaking this obsession is extremely important. But that's not for this scene. This scene is more so going to be ending and I'm continuing to give Sonic reason to stay focused on Eggman. Because as much as I'm trying to break this obsession, I also need to keep it there so I can carry Sonic all the way to this climax. And so it's where we get with the story at this point as we get to the end of the scene. And show he's now using going after Eggman as an excuse to buy Tails time. And this is again building, he's literally using Tails now as an excuse to go after Eggman. His denial and obsession are getting that bad. And it's going to be fun to break it. It really is. I just hope I write it well so it's believable and enjoyable. But so I've really taken the time now to build this obsession. And so as I get to the final paragraph, I take the time to recap what was going on with Eggman versus nature, and address the fact that Sonic is facing this obsession of his without being quite so in the face of it. But I also take the time to highlight that everything's going a particular way. And so, this also now brings me to the game design needs of my narrative. And as you'll see, I got a rather long note here at the end. And I give a bunch of gameplay things for players to do to go, okay, finally, done with another cutscene. Let me just play. And lots of game play to run around in. And lots of things to do. Just let the player play around for a bit and have fun at the level. And but I even say where the next event's going to be. And so, if you recall me talking about describing the death egg, the traps, the missiles, the elevators, the electrified floors, all that stuff, and then I should put it into the opening descriptions, then it starts to become clear that the next scene is literally going to be Sonic reaching Eggman. All this game design stuff doesn't mean a thing. And it's nice on the player side, it's nice for the story structure. I've already talked about in narrative that Sonic's going to be doing it. And unless something happens at these events to actually change the story, there's all of no reason to tell the story or to tell these events because they're generally meaningless in the grand scheme of things. And as I'm telling my story in short bits, which are designed to fit within a certain circumstance, it results in not needing to cover that stuff, and I'm able to jump from plot point to plot point. Now, things will slow down at the next episode, as it will be more about character building at that point, and introducing characters and concepts around them. But for the moment, at least, I'm ramping up to the climax, things are accelerating, and even though there's a lot to do, ultimately the story structure is leading now to it's just time for Sonic to confront Eggman. It's time to face his obsession. It's time for his obsession to take him to Eggman and for him to be faced with the truth. And that truth will be the climax of the story. And as such, I'll be able to then go into the follow-up or the cooldown of the story and set up what's going to come next. And so, I hope everybody will enjoy that. And with all that said, I've reached the end of the document, which means it's time to run the editor and see what problems I got. It's a great time for everybody to ask questions. If you have any, I'll be glad to answer them. And boy, there we go. Let's go ahead and clean this up a little now. Never usually takes all that long. Eggman Land? Yes, let me make sure I clarify that for those who don't know. If you're familiar with the English dub of the Sonic OVA, you will know the city as Robotropolis. If you're familiar with the sub instead, like I am, you will know that it is Eggman Land. That is literally Eggman Land in the OVA. It is actually a built and functioning location. The first time that you ever see Eggman Land in the games, well, in the IP, is not Sonic Unleashed. It is the OVA. And so, for the most part, the idea of Eggman Land and Eggman having this big super city that's all his. It honestly, it's hard to really say that I'll ever have Eggman Land, because to me, Eggman having these cities and bases is just normal stuff he has. The specific focus on distinctly Eggman Land, especially in light of having built the Death Egg, it always feels so small scale to me. I mean, literally, Eggman talks about wiping out Station Square in Sonic Adventure to make Eggman Land, which is fine. Except Eggman Land is just a big city with his face plastered all over it. If you take the time to walk around the Domestic Ruins area, and instead of going into Final Egg, you look out at Final Egg. Final Egg is already a huge, sprawling Eggman city. And it is totally covered in his aesthetic. It is literally Eggman Land in and of itself right there. Anytime Eggman builds a city, it's Eggman Land. And so the idea of Robotropolis, Eggman Land, or anything else you want to call an Eggman run city is... it feels weird to me to elevate such a small scale idea into something on the scale of his attempts to conquer the world, when it really just feels like any other base. It's such a bizarre dichotomy to me, and so I will probably have plenty of Eggman cities. They just won't necessarily have that focus of the importance of that Eggman Land is given. And it's not that I'm trying to underplay the importance of Eggman Land, because Eggman cities are important to him. They are a huge part of his ever-growing continents. The face of Eggman and the Eggman Empire, these cities that only he can build. They're extremely important to him, and extremely important to his show, the presentation of himself, showing the world what he's capable of. And so it will be necessary at some point to show the contrast between an Eggman city and how I'll have the rest of the world throughout the story. Is it will really be a defining difference to show just how advanced he is and what he does offer despite the consequences. And with that question asked, though, that actually wraps up the stream now. Which is all kinds of awesome, because with the stream wrapped up, well, I should say the scene, I can wrap up the stream. And so, that means I get to turn this little screen on, and let everybody know that I will be back tomorrow. And that will also mark the return of the main theme by Shimshon the Gadite. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. Thanks for the questions and being at the stream today, Mecha from the 80s. Really appreciate having you here. But for now, it's time for me to wrap up and call it a morning. I hope to see everybody tomorrow for the next stream. And there is no and or ifs or buts about it. It is time for Sonic and Eggman to fight. Hopefully I can do everything I need to in 15,000 characters. I'll see everyone then, and until then, stay well, everyone.